Good morning and welcome to the Japan Society's regular webinar on current affairs and business. I am Bill Emmott and I have the honor and pleasure of chairing the Japan Society and of moderating these webinars. Thank you all for your continued support for the Japan Society and for these webinars too. Well, we have a declared winner in the US presidential election, even if the loser has not conceded and shows no sign of doing so gracefully. The dispute is not a pretty sight, but we should remember that the election was only 1 week ago. The 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore took a month to resolve, as the Electoral College tallies were so close that a few hundred votes in Florida made all the difference. As I wrote in my blog this past week, the illustration from the Economist cover in the week of that election is normally on the wall in my study here. So I'll show it on camera now. The two combatants using the state of Florida as weapons. Hopefully we won't have weapons being used this time. In the end, in 2000, once the Supreme Court had given its verdict about those Florida votes, Al Gore conceded and withdrew gracefully. As Donald Trump likes to say, we'll see what happens, but gracefully isn't a word normally associated with him, unfortunately. Regardless of that dispute, the world swirls on around the United States in a troubled and turbulent manner. Our topic this week is that geopolitical and security turbulence, and about what difference the United States election outcome might make, both in general to the world and specifically to the UK and Japan. To provide their assessment, I'm delighted to give a warm welcome to two distinguished and seasoned insiders from the security world in our two countries. In Japan, our guest is Nobukatsu Kanehara, who is now a professor at Doshisha University in Kyoto, but previously had a long career in public service, culminating in the role as Deputy National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe from 2013 to 2019 in the newly established National Security Secretariat. And in the UK, today from Norfolk, our guest is Sir John Scarlett, who served as Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, better known as MI6, from 2004 to 2009. He first joined SIS in 1971, served in many posts, and as perhaps befits his generation, especially in MI6, he is a fluent Russian speaker and has been something of a specialist on Russia. Each of our speakers will open with 10 minutes of remarks, following which we will have a discussion and, most important of all, your questions. As usual, please submit questions using the Q&A function, and do vote for other people's questions if you'd like me to spot them more quickly. I've asked John Scarlett to open for us today, giving us a brisk version of the briefing he might give President-elect Biden on the main geopolitical and security challenges, and, if he thinks fit, Britain's role. I'll then follow with Kanehara-san. Over to you, John, and welcome to the Japan Society.
Thank you very much, Bill. Welcome, everybody. Before I begin my briefing, I just want to point out, following that introduction from Bill, that when I joined the service in 1971, I was a very young officer. It's just necessary to explain that. Right, now we turn to the briefing for the new president. Now, what I want to say to Mr. President, or Mr. President-elect, is that the key and central issue, if we're giving a geopolitical briefing, is, of course, to underline the return of great power rivalry. This is a recognized key feature of the geopolitical scene that we are currently watching. Now, what does that mean in practice for the President of the United States? Well, of course, above all, it means all the issues that relate to China. People talk about rising power, China and so on, but obviously increasingly we're all behaving as if it is a risen and established global power, in effect, one of the two superpowers. And in the last 8 years, a power which has behaved with increasing assertion around a whole range of issues, of course, in particular within East Asia and the Indo-Pacific. And now I'm just going to mention a few issues here, hardly issues, but just the countries and states that are affected by this. But obviously we can have discussion about all this later on. But they are issues which the new president will have to confront in one way or another. And of course, the relationships or the countries which are centrally involved with all this, obviously fundamentally for different reasons: India, Australia, and perhaps in particular, in a complicated way, which we can discuss later on, Japan. And then I'll talk about the particular difficulties and issues which are there. But that's just a sort of starting point. I can certainly spread more widely. And then, of course, above all, in a way, with the United States, which is the other superpower, and a whole range of tensions or potential tensions and challenges. People talk all the time about decoupling in the technology and economic sphere to reduce dependence on China. And then, of course, how to confront a range of geopolitical issues or regional issues. Taiwan is absolutely there the whole time, South China Sea, and so on. I think it's just worth pointing out here, particularly regarding the United States, that how things have changed in attitudes within the United States on a bipartisan basis since 2017, 2018 in particular. It first became absolutely evident to me that the mood had changed when I went to the Aspen Security Forum in 2018. It's just as well to remember that, to keep it in context. The other key point to make for the president-elect, is that somehow or another, the response to these very, very important developments is still unclear. And the response of the United States is still unclear. And for the new president, a key challenge is going to be, how do we find a way forward in this situation? There is no easy answer. And now, of course, the great power rivalry also does, include Russia. They'd be annoyed if I left them out. And they properly belong under that definition of great power. Of course, we're looking at nuclear power, weaponry in particular, and also geopolitical assertion, particularly in the Middle East and in sub-Saharan Africa, and in Eastern Europe and so on, where there's a lot of assertive behavior, and we can discuss that. But fundamentally, it's different from China. It's a much less confident situation, the economy, demographics, whole range of complicated issues in the region. Nagorno-Karabakh is the most recent one that we've seen. And then a very interesting set of issues, which again, the president will have to understand about the relationship between Europe, Western Europe or European allies, and Russia. Now, famously, at the beginning of the Obama presidency, there was an attempted reset of relationship with Russia. I can honestly say at the time that I questioned this and got rather stamped on by people connected with the White House. But I feel that 10 years later, I can say, well, almost everybody says it was right to question it. And I don't think anybody's going to try a reset again. I talk about great power rivalry, but it's very, very important that we don't somehow or another forget or omit to think or become complacent about non-state actors, which of course until recently was an absolutely dominating theme. Islamist extremism, terrorism, that absolutely has not gone away, and there is no room for complacency, but it's taking many new and different forms which have very important political and societal consequences, as well as pure physical danger consequences. And what's been happening in Europe and France, and I say Austria in particular, France in particular, in the last few weeks is something which maybe is telling us something there. Now, the other thing that the president also has to think about, of course, we all have to think about, is, well, what's the impact of the pandemic on this situation that I've just been describing? I think it's pretty clear, I would argue, up until now at least, that the fundamental impact of the pandemic has been to accentuate these trends which are already there. And I'd like to say something different. I'd like to say something more complicated, but I'm not sure I can. It's accentuated the interstate rivalry, particularly at the great power level. And I mean, rivalry, we'll just have to look at what's happened around vaccines and vaccine competition to understand that. It also introduced into the whole thinking about national security for people like me, maybe, and Mr. Kanehara, just what do we mean by national security when we see the consequences of a global pandemic of this kind, which in theory we've looked at as a national security point, but in reality, we've not really thought it through. And then, of course, going back to the point of great power relations, we have the consequences, maybe longer term, for global attitudes towards China and China's attitude towards the world outside. And, at the end of the day, how much detail and argument goes on, the point that this virus started in China, and there are unanswered questions about exactly how it started and how the state initially responded to it. This is there. It's not going to go away. And there's quite a lot of evidence now that global opinion has become much more critical, or many countries has become much more critical of China than was previously the case, although that's not a total picture. Right, if I can just move on quickly by saying, of course, the president has to understand that the other really major event is the US presidential election, and how the whole world is now watching the United States. People are always talking about the decline of the United States. And I'm always saying, okay, well, if the United States power was really declining, why does everybody talk about it all the time? The reality is that everybody, everywhere, every country has to think about the United States, and because whatever the United States does has impact on everybody. So rivals and allies and neutrals, they're all watching very closely. And we can discuss this, no doubt. But for China, how is it reacting to the prospect of a presidency with the president-elect Biden? Yeah, you can argue it both ways. Personally, I suspect they're pretty concerned and worried. They won't have understood President Trump, particularly nobody did. But all the same, they sort of were getting used to managing him in one way or another. But now they have to worry about potentially much greater emphasis on human rights issues, and of course, much closer relationships between the United States and allies regarding China. Russia, they will also worry about the new president, but they'll also be feeling that, well, he's more predictable. And it'll be perhaps a bit easier for them to respond and to manage it than it was with Trump, whatever everybody says about Trump and Russia. With the allies, and that's the allies in Europe, Australia, and Japan, of course, will be feeling that there is more trust and there is more commitment to alliances on the part, or there will be, on the part of an administration, a Biden administration. But the worry that's been generated, I think, with all the countries that I've mentioned by the Trump presidency, isn't going to go away. It leaves a degree of uncertainty about the future and about US commitment. And so everybody will be looking for reassurance in the way President Biden or President-elect Biden behaves. And clearly we're talking about rejoining the WHO, rejoining the Paris Agreement, possibly even, although I know it's complicated, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But one big worry is going to be, he's going to have such big domestic preoccupations that is he going to have time to worry about traditional allies? For example, is he really going to have time to worry about all the complexities in East Asia? And obviously he's a cautious guy. I'm going to sort of, well, almost finish by just saying, well, okay, summarizing the big issues that are there, unavoidably, he's going to have to think about. Clearly, I think definitely the management of China and that relationship and Chinese behavior geopolitically is a fundamental issue. And I flag up Taiwan in all that, as the most immediate there are many issues that could be talked about, but I'll flag up Taiwan to generate discussion. Of course, also North Korea. We possibly may expect some kind of gesture, military gesture, missile gesture from North Korea anytime now, and I'm quite sure that that's everybody's mind in Japan. With Russia, well, we'll see. The Russians are trying to sort of put out signals that they're going to be reasonable and manageable, but at the end of the day, as we've been reminded recently, the Russian government and decision-making is a very ruthless business. And then finally, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but certainly we'll be discussing it, I'm sure, there's a whole range of issues which are there in the Middle East and North Africa, some of which have big potential global impact. And I'm thinking there particularly, of course, about Iran, but also a lot of issues around what's going on with Turkish policy as well, which are going to be unavoidable for the new president. Now, finally, with Japan, I'm bound to mention it because it just so happens that I don't know whether everybody or anybody has read the London Times today, but there is an article or op-ed in the London Times by Roger Boys, who's one of their regular contributors, on the US and Japan, particularly Japan, and that relationship in the period ahead for the new president. And I was interested to read it because I'd sort of been thinking the same thing as I was preparing these introductory comments now. That the relationship with Japan for the United States, it's sort of a fundamental feature. It affects and comes into play and problem in one way or another, and certainly an indispensable partner in East Asia, but maybe beyond. And so we have to hope that the new administration will be focusing very carefully indeed on an intelligent and thoughtful policy regarding the relationship with one of its most fundamental allies, Japan. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, John. And that leaves us plenty to discuss, including, I think, we'll explore as well what, as it were, warm, fuzzy feelings of being nicer about allies really might mean as far as those allies are concerned. And I think we will come back to South Korea and Iran, I'm sure. But on to Kanehara-san for the Japanese point of view and your sense of that, the end of that important alliance. And I think you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much, Sir John, for your very comprehensive analysis of the global affairs. Japan is, I think we are a bit relieved to see Mr. Biden is elected simply because Japan, US was privileged because Abe-san was very close to Mr. Trump, but it was only us. We're worried about the, decaying relationship, transatlantic one. And Europeans are very angry. And now we see China, as Pompeo said, we need the unity of the West, but where is it? So that's our question. And the American leadership should be rehabilitated. One big reservation is Trumpian. And they're very angry people. And they say, look at us. Domestically, we have big problems. And COVID will leave a deep scar in the industry. And they have to rehabilitate, just like it's a heart attack. After that, the muscles are weakened because blood is circulating badly. And this is what's happening in the United States. And new president must take care of the economy, and his attention will be drawn to domestic affairs. It's a big reservation, but we want very much that American leadership is rehabilitated under Mr. Biden. I have to say that the liberal order is very important for Asia now, and it's a very different phase of history. In Europe, in the United States, the late 18th century, liberal thinking was a very dangerous one. The Americans had the independence war, and French had the big revolution and killed the king, and Europeans acted against it. But the late 19th century is very popular, and Japan followed it. We opened up our parliament in 1890, general elections in 1890. It was heavily oppressed by the government, but we had it anyway, simply because it's very popular in Europe, in the United States. We did it. But in early 20th century, the totalitarian thinking came up because of the social gap. And the communism is not only communism. Nazi it's a Labour Party. It's German Labour Party is Nazi, and we had the politicized military. They wanted to resolve this by force, the social gap. Emperor was very angry, but they did it. And this kind of things happened in early 20th century, but latter half of 20th century, we had liberalism again, very successful thanks to American leadership, and Europeans came back to power with the Union. And we thought it's liberalism. After the Cold War is over, Soviet Union collapsed. We said, this is our victory. Now we're in trouble. That's the West. The America first in the United States, Brexit in Europe. In Asia, it's very different. They were under colonial rule up to 1950s. And they wanted a very quick developments and ideal society and less social gap. And they became all dictators. It's only Japan and India who were functioning democracies. All the others were dictators. There was no free zone in Asia at all. It's only after the Cold War is over, many nations after developing quite fast, they turned one by one to democracy. The first is Philippines, 1986. They are the first. They said we took back independence and democracy in 1812. And then Korea follows, 1987. ASEAN nations followed. This is very new here. Of course, we have Rohingya issues, extrajudicial killing of the drug dealers, many problems, and even Thais are very angry against their king. And this is still very shaky, but we are having the new era of liberalism in Asia. We have to push this forward, and they are very proud. We try to teach them what democracy is, but they are very angry because they say, we have democracy and we built it ourselves. Not thanks to you. It is our own democracy, many flaws, but it is ours. Now they are very proud. We have to engage them. And this is our basic policy. And then we now, 150 years of this modernization process, we roughly know that the industry comes very easy. This technology and mathematics, nation state can be made somehow without difficulties, but the democracy comes very late. It's only 100 years later. This happens. This must happen in China too, but they are in midway, they can make big mistakes. Industry can give them huge power, incomparable in Asia. They can be very nationalistic and they can be very expansionist because nobody can stop them. And they are very they're evil in French, it's drinking. They are a bit crazy about their own nationalism. It's like measles, you have to go through that. It's the youth of the industrialization. The nation state can go must through that. They are still there. And we have to engage them somehow. Can we engage them? Well, I have to say two big obstacles in China. One is they became overconfident. After Lehman shock, they pulled the world economy. As we did with the Germans in 1970s, we became too much proud, too much confident of our economic power. They're a bit like that. They think that the US back is here. They can catch up. They go beyond the United States. They believe that today. I think it's very wrong, but they believe it. Second is it's amazing to see that they say we're victims of the history, Japanese and the Opium War, etc. This started with Deng Xiaoping. Mao never said that. He was very proud. He never said that. Why Deng Xiaoping said that? Simply because after Tiananmen, they shut the door against democracy, but he introduced foreign money, and they became capitalist. And they can no longer say Marx, Lenin, Engels. They can never say that. They need something else. That's nationalism. They started to say we are victims of history, victims of all the Europeans and Japanese and Americans. We have to take back our own status, and that's revanchism of history is imprinted in the young ones. With rising status of China, it's becoming poisonous. It's what's happening in Asia. In Hong Kong, it's not the issue of human rights for them at all. It's the victims of Opium War. We have to take back the history. And that's all. And unfortunately, Xi's generation was the generation of cultural revolution. Their chance for getting high education was destroyed by Mao. And they don't share our sympathy towards this liberal version of the world history. It's 19th century. Big ones must conquer the world, and that's it. And this is their difficulties. So it takes more time for them to come back to the West. They are leaving the West now. So can we engage them? I think we can do that still. China is 60% of world GNP. United States 25%. EU 25%. Japan is now 7%. Sorry, but we are now 7%. India is 3.5%. They are now half size of Japan today. Together with us, Indians, Japanese, Europeans, and Americans, we go easily beyond half of the world economy. China can never reach this size. They can be a regional hegemon. They can never be a global hegemon. That means we can engage them if we craft a good strategy. Our strategy is, unfortunately, we don't have NATO here. American Pacific Alliance system is very weak. It's bilateral, no organization, no coordination. It's only Americans coming up from the Pacific coast. But we have big ones. They're capable. And the Australia, first of all, it's the size of small, 23 million, size of Taiwan, but the small army, but lethal, very well integrated with American forces. Korea is not a big power. Unfortunately, they are divided like Cold War domestic politics still. Leftists do not like military cooperation with United States and Japan, and they want to be very close to North Korea and China. And now we cannot trust their strategic directions today. They might be back, but not today. And Philippines and Thais are allies of the United States, but they are not true military power in the region. So we need somebody else, and that's India. Indian population is not going beyond China soon, and they are 10 years younger, their population. Chinese are 39 years old in average, but Indians are 29 years old. Amazing, isn't it? And they are coming up very quickly, and we have to be engaged with the Indians. And the West, not us, but the Americans took hands of Stalin to defeat Hitler and Tojo. And then to face Russians for 50 years, Americans embraced Mao. And the West alienated the Indians. Indians are very angry. But the India is the democracy, the creation of Gandhi and Nehru. This is, in terms of values, the most natural ally for us. They are still not yet very ready to cooperate fully with us, but we have to engage them. That is the only one possible counterbalance of China, future superpower. And this is acquired. Japan, Washington, Delhi, and Canberra. And with this strategic framework, we can build upon it for the FOIP. FOIP is a grand strategy. This is not military strategy at all. We have to include the economic aspects, value aspects. Then we can engage ASEAN nations. They want to be neutral. Don't involve me in the big ones fights. That's ASEAN nation. They saw Cambodia destroyed completely by the Vietnam War. That's the reason why they're united. But they do not want to be compelled by China, swallowed by China. So they are now thinking, so we have to present them, no, this is a prosperity, this is free trade, this is TPP, CPTPP, RCEP. Now we have to push forward regional integration. We can help it. The OBOR, one way, one road, is not only one option. It's only one option, but you have much bigger option. OBOR is China center and the bilateral starlight relationship, but our matrix type integration means we have to connect everybody, and the free trade, free market must function. That would integrate the regional economy. That's us. And lastly, I have to say, in terms of values, China has absolutely no idea to lead. They say common destiny. What's common destiny? We said the same thing before the war. Called prosperity in Greater East Asia. It's the same thing. China Center, kicking out the white people. And this is Asia in Asian hands. It's the China's under China's leadership. We said the same thing, but nobody bought the idea. And nobody buys the Chinese common destiny idea at all. We have to build a liberal order here, and everybody is headed for that. So in the end, we can win, but it takes time. And Taiwan is a huge issue. And Taiwan is real. They will not do that today, but if they believe that they can finish the war during 2 weeks, they will do it. And it's not impossible 10 years later. Now we have to be prepared for that. Can I say one word on Iran?
Okay, one more thing. Absolutely, yes. Go on.
That's Iran. That's Iran. We are just helping American Middle East policy. We have great relationship with the Gulf nations from which we buy oil, but stability is very important. We can't have influence in the Middle East, so we're helping Americans, helping Egypt, helping Jordan, and helping somehow Israel, and keeping good ties with the Gulf nations. That was our Middle East policy. Iran was a good part, but the nuclear deal with Iran was abolished by Mr. Trump, but it should be rehabilitated. But there are 2-3 points that Trump made rightly. One is sunset clause. What would happen after sunset clause? We can't be dependent upon the goodwill. We have to do something for that. Developing missiles and starting again the nuclear program, having warheads, it's not possible. We can't let it happen. Missile part is very difficult. They'll never agree to reduce their missile capabilities. But we have to say that, and we have to make a deal with them. The difficulties they are creating in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon and Yemen, they have to consider something. Otherwise, we can't believe they're in their goodwill. And overcoming these difficulties, restarting the negotiation with Iran is possible, but be careful because Mr. Biden serves only one term. They know it. That means they'll make 4 years negotiations step by step. They're very good negotiators. They'll ask you the costs of the negotiating. They are asking the participation fee for the negotiation. They're very good at it. And towards the end of the negotiation, they know that the negotiators will be in a hurry, and they can make a cheap bargain sale, and Iran can be waiting for that. So we have to be very vigilant against Iran because they are very good negotiators. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Nobu. And that gives us a very clear sense of the sort of matrix approach and the grand strategy that Japan needs and thinks about. And I think the final point about the brevity of the Biden administration is an important one that for us all to remember, not necessarily because we know what the outcome in 2024 will be, but rather that any counterpart has to think in rather short time and can play out the clock. Now, one of those, I think we'll just move specifically from the questions. One of those who's been always good at playing out the clock has been Kim Jong-un and North Korea. One questioner has asked what changes in foreign policy, if any, are we likely to see during a Biden administration when it comes to North Korea? And what would the implications thereof be, both for Asia-Pacific nations and for the international community? Can Kim Jong-un really afford to reignite tensions with the US, given the precarious state of the North Korean economy? Let me ask John, since you mentioned it, and John to answer that first, and then you, Kanehara-san. How can North Korea play out, do you think, and be played out?
Right. Well, I'll pick up the point there by saying that for all the talk about North Korea and different stages of the Trump presidency, it's been a semi-dominating issue. There's never, to my mind, been a clear way forward identified. And obviously this relates to North Korea's status as a nuclear power, and it's pretty much there as an acknowledged nuclear power. So here we have one of the least successful and poorest countries in the world belonging, in effect, to the nuclear weapons state club, which is an extraordinary state of affairs. And the objective, of course, inevitably of the US policy has been to change that. But nobody has come up with a way forward which really gives a credible, answer to it. So there'll have to be some sort of compromise, almost inevitably, but that will mean accepting, in effect, North Korea's status as an internationally capable nuclear weapons state. And are we really ready to do that? But if we're not, then Kim Jong-un, almost certainly isn't going to be ready to proceed because, it's clear that he sees that the security of his regime depends upon their some military capability, and especially in this area. And that fundamental blockage, intellectual and political, military, nobody's seen a way through it. Now, what that means logically is that this could quickly become a very difficult issue. President Biden, hasn't come up yet with any obvious answers to it, but almost certainly he'll be looking to keep things calm, to build up some kind of relationship, some kind of contact, get dialogue back in a sort of civilized way again, but without great big sort of showman summits, and see whether some kind of detailed compromise can't be worked out. I mean, that'll be almost certainly the instinct of the Biden administration. But of course, that assumes that Kim Jong-un will stay more or less quiet and under control. And yet here we've just seen a demonstration of a new intercontinental ballistic missile capability. The temptation for him to use that or to restart tests or to do some kind of quite provocative gesture, that could come at any time, and we all know that. And then what will be the right response to that, we don't know. So certainly one of the things that I'm looking for in the period immediately ahead is how Kim Jong-un behaves. And of course, always in the background there, we have to remember the key point about his relationship with China and the role that China will play in the development of North Korean policy, and to what extent he'll get sort of reassurance, as he did back in 2017, 2018. He'll get some sort of reassurance that China will be sort of helpful in preventing. But then it's China that counts when we talk about North Korea. It's not Japan, and it's certainly not the United States. And they'll want to remind us of that. Stop.
So, Nobu, do you see, from Tokyo, do you see North Korea essentially as a subset of China policy, or is it a separate category?
Absolutely. The Korean Peninsula is so close to China, so close to Beijing. After the Opium War, a second Opium War, and French and the British forces invaded Beijing from Tianjin. It's in the Bohai Bay. The Korean Peninsula, it's at the entrance of Bohai Bay. They can never lose that. We should remember that Mao did not invade Taiwan. They invaded the Korean Peninsula to fight against Americans. They could never lose Korean Peninsula. They were, ruler of the peninsula for many centuries. We gave them independence after Sino-Japanese War. It's a very brief time. It was a vassal state for a long time, simply because it's too important for them to lose. And now taking back North Korea again, they'll never lose it. North is firmly on the orbit of China. They can never go out of it. And our policy is very clear. We talked that with President Clinton in 1990s and Bill Perry. We said to the North Koreans, abandon nukes and return abductees. We can help you like Eastern Europeans, massive amount of money. You can be better off. You can be not democratic, but like Vietnam. That's a message that angers China very much. Don't touch my boy. This is my boy. That's Chinese true geopolitical interests. They say we're P5 members, we are non-proliferation supporter. They believe that. They are right in saying that, but geopolitically, they're very different interests, and they'll never release North Korea from their orbit. That means this negotiation is very difficult. I have to say North Korea is very much suffering from the COVID, and border is shut. The smugglers are the true pipes, economic pipes to keep them alive with China. Now they are shut. Typhoon hit them hard. And North Korea is in trouble today. And they are weakened. But they can never jump onto our knees. We're happy to help them, but they can't do that because China stops them. For China, I believe that, leaving North Korea or keeping North Korean nuclear weapons, which is better option for them. Keeping nukes in Korea is better than losing North Korea to United States and Japan. So they'll never help us in the end. This continues. And so sanction is very necessary. At some moments, if China can agree to talk with us, the future status of the peninsula, we can have a deal with them. But they don't do that. They're happy with the status quo. And sanction is very much necessary. And China will help them. So sanction has a limit. But this is the only way. We cannot do tit-for-tat tactics again because they have the nuclear weapons. They were ready to surrender Yongbyon in Singapore. But President Trump rightly said, Mr. Bolton was there, kicked it out. Simply because the first question to ask is, where's the bomb? Where do you keep your bombs? Are they deployed? Where are the factories? And Yongbyon is an important part, but the big question is, where do you have your bomb? And they have no idea to surrender their bombs. Yongbyon is a show window, but we have to go to the arsenal. And there, they have no intention to negotiate, to surrender these military capabilities. So this continues. So the answer is very simple one. Sanction must be continued with limits, but we have to be prepared militarily. That's the only one option. And then China will think again. Japan was very much, pacifist nation, anti-nuclear nation, but threatened truly by North Korea by nuclear weapons. We have to now talk about this nationally. We have never had nationwide nuclear debates before. But I believe that we have to start that. Nobody bought my idea in the government, but I'm outside the government. I'm speaking this out. Now, Germans talked about nuclear weapons very seriously, and they have NATO weapons. But Japan was so silent about nuclear weapons. Japanese prime minister never raised this issue to the American president. Can you truly protect us from Russian, Chinese, North Korean nuclear weapons? We never asked this question, but we have to ask a question: how can we do that? How can we enhance your credibility, American umbrella of nuclear weapons? And this issue should come to the center of the national security debate in Japan.
And that is, thank you. And that is also why, of course, just to add to that, why the issue of missile defense and questions of preemptive strikes have been the overt part of the debate in Japan, even if not the nuclear part of it.
Yeah, but that debate is distorted because we have no tradition of that kind of debates. People are shooting in the dark. They're very wrong. We can't do any preemptive attacks against North Korean missiles because the missiles are on track. They're moving in the darkness in the woods. We cannot do this preemptively. Yeah. What Abe-san proposed to have a debate is we have to shoot. If we are shot, we have to shoot back. Not nuclear weapons, the conventional ones. And the Chinese, Russians, North Koreans have intermediate range nuclear weapons now, but the Koreans and Taiwanese have ballistic, cruise, intermediate range missiles. And we are only buying, the bulletproof vest. This is silver. This is not platinum. This is not very expensive. So Abe-san said, stupid. Think to protect this nation. We have to shoot back. When you shoot me, I'll shoot back. This is not preemptive. This is shooting back after a shot. This is a debate of Abe-san. Abe-san ordered already. We have now 1,000-kilometer cruise missile shot from the F-15. We have them now. We say we use this for defending our remote islands. If we change directions, of course we can shoot enemies. And this is a true debate, not preemptive missiles.
Thank you. No, that's fascinating. I will come back to the UK in a moment, but first I want to follow up on the question about Japan's sort of matrix and the relationships within Asia. Andrew Fraser has followed on about the Roger Boys article in the Times, and points out he went way beyond US-Japan bilateral and argued for the idea of intersecting coalitions to tackle different dimensions of the Chinese challenge, G7, the Quad, a notional D10 of democratic powers, etc., which is somewhat together with what the analysis that Kanehara-san was providing. Another questioner has asked a related question that can Japan become a formal member of the Five Eyes network? So perhaps, John, that is so much directed at you, really, about Five Eyes, but also about how do you think about this matrix idea within Asia?
Well, that's quite right. That was this sort of theme, quite complicated theme at the end of the day, underlying what the Times op-ed said. But of course, the key point, I think, if I remembered it correctly, was that the common factor in almost all these different groupings was Japan. And that was what he was trying to get across. So and that underlined his point that Japan was a potentially crucial partner, fundamental feature of for US policy, not just in East Asia, but more broadly, certainly right across the Indo-Pacific. And it's not one that gets very much debate, certainly in the Western sort of side, and the Western media, and so in that whole quite complicated question. So that's a very interesting issue, of course. On the Five Eyes, well, ever since, of course, the Five Eyes have been around since, well, in fact, I know March 1946 was when the Britain-USA intelligence partnership was sort of set up, and then the British Dominions at the time came into that, and that's where the Five Eyes goes back to. And it's developed over the years, and it was always it was very discreet, and we didn't talk about it very much. But it's always been, it's a fundamentally important feature of the relationship between those five countries, and of course, it's grown in importance for obvious reasons, global reasons, in recent times. But really, until Edward Snowden came out in 2013, people didn't talk about it very much. Now, I find that, quite often I get asked that question, can we join the Five Eyes? I've certainly been asked it by Japanese colleagues and friends, but not only that. The only people who actually haven't really asked about it are the French, who I think understand that they wouldn't really be interested. They've got their own ideas. But of course, my answer always is, I'm afraid that Five Eyes means Five Eyes means Five Eyes. It's just not, once you go beyond Five Eyes, you get into a never-ending changing situation, and it's just not going to happen. You really have to go into the history of it and the culture of it and all the rest of it. But I'm wary of it being used as a political symbol or a political type of alliance, because it's not really a political alliance. It's essentially an intelligence and security combination, which reflects a political relationship, which is there anyway. That goes back, well, the reality of it goes back, I won't go on about history anymore, but the reality goes back, and I'll tell you, the 8th of February, 1941, when 10 months before the United States entered the war, Second World War, an exchange of fundamental secrets between the UK and the US took place at Bletchley Park, where I used to be the chairman of the trust, in the office of the director. And that was something which happened between two countries who didn't even have a formal alliance with each other, but exchanged their very biggest secrets about code breaking. And that was the date on which this started. There's a lot of history there. That's how it is. But I won't say any more about that.
Thank you. No, that's fascinating. That's very interesting. Now, there's a question, specific question about Taiwan, which Duncan Bartlett has asked. He says, Kanehara-san said that China could invade and occupy Taiwan if it could win a war inside 2 weeks. And he adds, in the event of a Chinese invasion or threat of an invasion, what would be Japan's response, bearing in mind the pacifist constitution? To which I think one can widen it. What would be the response of the United States and other countries? Perhaps starting with you, Kanehara-san. Oh,
thank you very much. This is not tomorrow's issue. This is the issue could be happening 10 years later. The two dimensions. First of all, it's sheer military power. We can't help Taiwan alone. We can't do it. We can't do it. If Americans do not come to help Taiwanese, we can't help them. This is sheer reality. This is first thing to say. Second is Americans have no obligation to help Taiwan. They have no alliance, and they have no co-training of the military. But they have the law to stay capable of defending Taiwan, the domestic law. And it depends upon Taiwanese political direction. Chen Shui-bian said, independence, independence. Americans said, don't provoke Chinese. I can't help if you do that. If that situation continues, It's difficult for Taiwanese to expect some American intervention. Tsai is very clever. She's keeping status quo. She's keeping, we are democratic, we have freedom, and we want a status quo. She says that. And with that, it's very difficult for the liberal powers to let Taiwan die like Hong Kong today. But this is a political game. So militarily, when Americans are intervening, we are automatically involved. We can't be neutral. We have their bases, and we don't know what China would react to us if Americans involve us in this Taiwan war. We have 250,000 very capable military forces, and Taiwan has 200,000. And would China fight against Japan, Taiwan, United States at the same time, or simply locally paralyze our military capabilities? I think the second would be what would happen in reality. And so, but when Chinese are not like Russians. Russians are warriors. They are provoked. When they are provoked, they fight. But China calculates all the time. If they lose, they don't fight. They are just like warriors. They circumvent. When they are in high position, they come in. When they're low, they don't come in. So when we are ready, they don't do that. If we have disarray, they might be tempted.
Thank you, John.
Yes, that's a very interesting and thoughtful response. I'd just like, when I mentioned it, we both mentioned Taiwan as being an immediately critical issue. Now, of course, that is, let's say, well, Kanehara-san says 10 years' time, it's not militarily relevant now, but 10 years is not that far away, and it's not a precise time. It could suddenly get shorter. And I just, as I study this and watch it all the time, what comes out to me is the emotional nature of Chinese policy towards Taiwan. It's just a different atmosphere, the way they talk, and certainly for Xi Jinping, it's an emotional and symbolic issue, which means that you can't quite be sure what might happen. If events suddenly get much sharper, and of course there's a very big amount of military activity and so on, which classically could lead to something a bit more complicated. And the other, another thing that I just say there, well, two other things quickly. One is US policy at the end of the day, although of course there have been big and important gestures from the Trump administration in recent months, but essentially, it's quite ambiguous. The degree of US commitment to Taiwan is ambiguous. And it does rely upon China at the end of the day being responsible. And yet, if you're dealing with something which is emotional, that is a tricky area. Final thing I'd say is I haven't been to Taiwan for several years, but when I was there a few years ago, I just couldn't help feeling as I was talking with everybody that somehow within them, there's an expectation that one day they'd be part of China. Not 5 years' time or even 10 years' time, but at some point into the future. And of course, 2049 is always flagged up as the date, the symbolic date. But I just came away a bit surprised by that, but recognizing that I wasn't sufficiently expert in the subject to really quite interpret it.
A broader question that comes back to really, or relates to a point that Kanehara-san said about that China has no idea how to lead, and indeed, as during the pandemic, even recently, has shown no real sustained desire to build friendships either, or alliances. I mean, only gestures. But at the same time, as Martin Hatfield asks in the questions, that we've had the debacle of the US election, and now with Trump's undermining of democratic principles, must raise questions about future electoral processes and the possible attitude to 2024 and beyond. Do either of you think that this might have fatally weakened any appeal that the Western democratic model has for other states around the world? Another way of saying, can America really lead in this weakened, divisive scenario? John? Should, obviously. But...
Well, Yeah, okay, very, very quickly. It's a good question. And as of now, the 11th of November, 2020, it's impossible to say how that's going to work out. I mean, clearly, the image and message which is being sent around the world about American democracy and American political structures is confusing. And I know that some people in the UK talk about, you know, the 18th century nature of the US Constitution and all the confusion around the Electoral College and so on, which we didn't used to think about very much. But then, of course, one has to point out that our own political structure comes from the 18th century as well. And that causes us quite a bit of confusion. And of course, that is sending signals out too about, you know, two of the bastions of liberal democracy. What message is it sending? So yes, it is a worry, and this is probably the fundamentally biggest challenge for the new administration. It could change with the right kind of leadership, because out in the world more widely, certainly in the whole range of liberal democratic countries, or would-be liberal democratic countries, there is basic goodwill and hope and some degree of expectation that progress will be made and will move into a different situation. So the willingness is there. This is a real leadership challenge for the new president.
Nobu, what do you make of?
I think this divide is rather on the issue of economy. Who takes care of me? That is a message from Trumpian, and they don't feel sympathy towards leftist ideology. And after manufacturing industry left the United States, they are going down slowly, but leftists are leftists, and that does not their agenda for nuclear zero or anti-abortion or environment does not ring the bell for them. I'm losing my job. What shall I do? And this is the big message coming from there. And this is not against their ideology. This is not against freedom. This is not against the equality of human dignity. And that is the core of American identity. They have absolutely no history in comparison with the Europeans and us. We have 1,000 years history, and they have nothing. But they share the principle that we are all equal. Human dignity is equal. And Americans, for the Asians, Americans broke the door for Asia by civil rights movement. And this has resonance in Asia. President Wilson had no idea of liberating Korea and China, but his self-determination rang the bell, big bell among Koreans, among Chinese. That's American ideology still have a big attraction for the Asians that China can never compete with. And the Trumpian will not betray that. I believe that, but they are drawing attention of the president to the domestic issues. Don't talk about the environment. The petroleum is important and it's a big job. And this is the debate today is happening in the United States. I still believe that their ideological glory will not diminish very drastically because of this divide. I hope. I could be wrong.
And we could, and it's worth saying that, I mean, in the exit from the pandemic, and certainly in economic terms, we may well absolutely need American leadership, and we might well need American leadership and ability to bring China into deals and arrangements to deal with third world debt crises that might well develop over the next 18, 24 months. So any real absence of American leadership could be pretty serious beyond simply, as it were, an ideological question. Now we're almost out of time, but there's one question that I think I would still like to pop to you, Kanehara-san, which is from Hervé Kure, who would like you to, he said, fascinating insights on Japan's strategy. Would it be possible for you to elaborate a bit further on free and open Indo-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific Japan blueprint, which perhaps I might get each of you just to say some last few words on? What's the sort of, where's the beef, as a previous American election campaigner said?
Shall I start?
Yes, why not?
There are 3 points. This is a very big ground strategy concept. We have to put the flesh to the bones now. And there's no short range big policy for that. But there are three levels. big purpose of that is engagement with China. Without FOIP, we can't engage China. And FOIP are 3 levels. One is strategic stability in the first place. Without stability, we cannot adjust our interests. We can talk with them. With the Russians, we did. At least transparency, least trust. We could manage arms control. And we can do that. It's a much bigger spectrum of issues with China if we have stability. That quad is very important. And engagement, British, French, and Germans are very important. But ASEAN nations are more interested in economic development. So we have to put on that the free trade and free economic integrations, regional economic integrations on that. And then on top of that, we have to put values because China must follow this. And they'll change. We'll never be communist. And they can change, but it takes 1 century. And during the time before they peak out, say their economy is now falling. I mean, I have to say their population is now falling. And they have big difficulties, ethnic minorities and social gap and wealth gap. And so they have to go through that. They are losing steam very slowly, but they're going to peak out by, say, 2050 or 2040. And we have to engage them during this time. And they might change. We have to wait for them to change. That's point.
Thank you. And so final word to John. I mean, really about India and its role and perhaps what the British attitude to it. I mean, there's a long consistency in American sort of courting of India from George W. Bush onwards, certainly. Long consistency in Japan's courting of India and building up this relationship since, again, the early 2000s, really. How do you really think India is capable of playing this balancing role? And what is a British view of our former colony?
Well, it was never quite a colony. It was more complicated than that, but yeah. There we are. Yeah. Well, obviously, a sort of key feature for India has been that it's such an enormous country, and it has such enormous resources, in particular people and potential, and yet its political and geopolitical and sort of international weight has never kept up with that underlying power and underlying reality. Now that may be changing, but I'm not completely sure. And there are many reasons why it remains very complicated. So I think it's important that when we talk about India as being part, for example, of the Quad and a key ally member for Japan and Australia and the United States, and maybe also the UK, and there's talk of that. People remember that India is a very complicated place and that South Asia is a very complicated place, and that there's a fundamental issue there about the relationship with Pakistan, which of course famously goes back to partition and beyond, which if one deals with Indian colleagues, you know, as obviously I've done, it sort of always somehow comes back to that. And so that's there. And that's a narrowing issue in terms of international behavior. And now, of course, we have the once again the reappearance of all the tensions with China, and so we're looking at India as part of that sort of, well, how do we deal with China issue? But we need to remember that it's a lot more complicated than that. As I often say to my children when they ask me something difficult and I don't have the answer, I say it's too complicated to explain. And that's my final point there. Remember that the Vice President-elect has an Indian heritage, and that is now being celebrated in her ancestral village, if you like, near Chennai. And yet her view of Indian politics and Indian policy is, I think, again, quite complicated. Yeah.
Very many thanks. I'm glad that we've answered so many and addressed so many complicated questions without grasp them very firmly in this discussion. I thank you both for doing that, John Scarlett and Nobukatsu Kanehara. One of the questions that I couldn't get to raised Pakistan and its role as, in many ways, China's ally, the historic ally, partly to weaken India. So our questioners were very much engaged by what you were both saying, and I thank you both for looking at this complicated and turbulent scene. And I thank all the attendees for this event as well, for sparing a bit time from your busy schedules to be with us. Thank you warmly again, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, Kanehara-san.